For me, it started to feel like the walls were closing in. I could see the writing on the wall. VC backed companies were paying top dollar because they weren't beholding to insurance. But sometimes they were the insurance companies, or at least in bed with them.
And that's the reality for so many practice owners. One day you look around and you realize you're not building freedom, you're building a cage. The question is, do you double down or do you walk away?
And what no one tells you in grad school is that scaling, selling, or even staying the course, those are all CEO decisions. They're emotional, financial, and deeply personal. If you don't stop to think about them, the system will make the choice for you.
So today we're unpacking the question every practice owner eventually faces. Should I scale, sell, or stay? And how do you know which choice is the right one for your business, for your life, and your sanity? What we're talking about today is scaling, staying, or selling. And I'm going to talk at the end about the selling piece because I did recently just sell my practice. But I think this is kind of where we all hope to get at some point is the scaling side of things if we're a little bit of an entrepreneur or business owner. And at least when I think about the people that listen to this podcast or that will listen to this podcast, I'm thinking there's two types. There's going to be people that are pure clinicians and they just see patients right now and they're still maybe in that traditional model where they've got 25 patients a week or whatever, and maybe they're working for someone or they're not necessarily having to deal with all the admin aspects of practice and somebody else is taking care of that, but maybe they're thinking about going out on their own. And then there are the people like us that own group practices and I think maybe have this freedom practice in mind. At least I did when I was scaling mine, where I thought, well, I'll just have everybody else see clients and then I'll just manage the business side from them and I won't have to work as much. And it ended up being my freedom practice ended up being more of a prison practice for me. So then you want to talk about what it's like to not live in a prison and how you scaled and just sort of where you gone from there.
So I think scaling gets glorified in our field, but I think the truth is growth can either give you a lot of freedom or it can multiply your burnout. For me, I learned that the hard way. I opened multiple locations. We have 3 locations currently, and we added more therapists. And from the outside, it looked like success, and we were growing. Our calls were increasing. But I think behind the scenes, I was completely drowning because all it did is multiply my burnout. I was more stressed, had more payroll issues. The emotional toll was just a lot for me, and the constant pressure to kind of keep it all afloat. So for me, it wasn't freedom when I was scaling. It was really burnout multiplied. And I think the thing practice owners, so many practice owners believe the myth that scaling means more money and less work. First of all, as I have grown and scaled, there has been a direct correlation of making less because you just have more expenses. So as you're scaling and growing, at least my experience, that was not the case. And if your systems aren't strong and if your people aren't supported, growth just makes the cracks in your practice wider. So the more locations you have, I feel like it's just easier to kind of see where you need more help. I think if you think about it, if your business doubled tomorrow, would it give you freedom or would it just double your stress?
Mm-hmm.
Could your phones even handle ringing off the hook if that even happened? So I think what I learned, and one thing that I want you to hear today, is that scaling only works in the right order. And again, this is just my experience. It has to be systems first, people second, and growth third. Now, I did the opposite. I was focusing so heavily on the people and the therapists and all of that. And that order just did not work for me. So I think that's my biggest takeaway. And I've had time to reflect on that over the last few years. When you get that order right, growth can finally give you freedom that you imagined. So when I talk about scaling now, I don't mean chasing size for the sake of it. I mean intentional scaling only what's profitable, what's joyful, and what's sustainable. Sometimes people will ask me, what's one thing I wish someone told me before we first expanded to our second location? And honestly, it's a few things. again, first, I know I'm always saying this, but first is really truly, you have to get your systems in place. Because if you don't expand until all of your systems can run without you. When I opened my second location, I thought more space equaled more success. But the truth was, I hadn't even built out strong processes of what we were doing yet. I had sticky notes on my desk, my laptop, my phone, everywhere, my notepad. I had all the systems in my head. I did not write everything down at that time. And even at the time, our scheduling system needed to be perfected. We didn't have a CRM at the time. We just answered each call and email with no process, no way to track the data, right? It was just like, it's also COVID. Things were just kind of happening fast. So we were just kind of figuring it out as we went. But if my office manager was out sick or on vacation, it was me who jumped back in to cover and to answer phones or to verify insurance. So the expansion didn't fix that issue. It just made the cracks impossible to ignore. And it magnified every weakness that we had in the business at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's something that people don't talk about enough. And Maureen Warback, she's with the group Practice Exchange, and she really helped me during that phase where she was able to, and I don't know, maybe she adapted this from somebody else, but it was a model of when you get to about 40 clinicians or 40 employees, um, that's when you sort of like it's going like this, it's going in this sort of upward trajectory. And then at 40, it really starts to just bottom out. And you've got this flat line because the amount of capital and systems that need to be in
Right.
place to make that work is a different level of growth. And most people, most group practice owners, that's sort of the valley of death, is where people go, oh, this isn't right, or this is too hard, this is
Right.
not what I wanted, and they stop and they sort of scale back. So did you feel like that was your experience, that when you started to hit 40, that was when you started to feel the pain a little bit more and not as much output for what you were putting in?
Right. So we have 25 therapists. So for me, I noticed a really big shift around 15. When we hit like, I want to say 18 to 20 therapists, that's when like we're going here. And then I feel like we flatlined at 20
Yeah.
for me. And again, maybe that's the area I'm in geographically and whatnot. But I definitely felt that,
Yeah.
because you're
And
paying for more, then you need more people to supervise.
right.
You now
Right.
need, you have multiple locations. You need more oversight at each location.
Yeah. When you were scaling, was there something that you had successfully delegated out? I always hear the best CEOs just know how to hire really well. They hire people that are smarter than them in all the other areas that they know that their strengths aren't aligned. So, were there certain people that maybe you put in charge of being the CFO or the COO or the marketer? What things had you successfully hired out?
So at that time, I had a great, and she's still with me, office manager. So that was a fantastic hire. And she definitely does all the billing and all the scheduling at that time. I had one that was kind of doing it all based on our numbers. And then I had someone that was starting to be, she was someone who had worked with us for a while as a therapist. And I made her director of operations. So then she was taking that piece off my plate. But I didn't do this. In retrospect, I wish I did all this sooner, And again, I know I'm kind of explaining in order. If I had the processes in place first, then I would know what I needed. So, I kind of was learning, as we all do, on the fly of like, okay, well, now I need this. So then I would hire for this. Well, I was hiring before I had the process even in place. So then I would change it because, a few months later, I'm like, wait a second, we don't need someone at that location overseeing. They're going to go to all 3 locations. It doesn't make sense to have, so it's like a learning process. So I think for me, the second piece with people is definitely the right people matter more than the right building. I assumed if I had the space that the therapist would come, and they did. And I have a great team. So I don't want to, say that I don't, I do. But hiring fast just to fill rooms definitely backfired at times for me. I remember hiring a therapist just to kind of fill the chair. And within months, they had poor boundaries, created more fires than I could put out. So it's easy to think a warm body solves the problem, but the wrong fit will cost you so much more than an empty office. The wrong hire can impact your work culture, which you work so hard to maintain, and you work so hard to, make it a positive, loving, supportive environment. And a wrong hire, if they can't retain clients, to be honest, they're like a ship with a hole in it. It's just like,
This is
now
so
I'm
true.
I'm the first person to be like, it's all about the right fit, right? For the client and for the therapist. I never want something to feel forced, but honestly, at the reality, you're a business owner. Like, you need a therapist who has good retention and who can hold on to their clients. So I've learned that, there's been maybe some great therapists that I personally really liked and valued, but if they can't retain clients, what are we doing here? So, and then I
Yeah.
think, and then a third area that I think if I could think back, is really looking at the money and the financials. I mean, expansion eats cash before it makes cash. The furniture alone, I remember spending like $34,000 on furniture for the new locations, putting it on, a credit card. And it didn't even include the, decorations and the artwork. And we repurposed a lot of things from our initial office space. Meanwhile, I'm paying rent on therapy rooms that sat empty for months while the main office was like bursting at the seams. So I wish I had proper financial runway savings at the time, instead of just thinking the new space is going to pay for itself. It does eventually, but it does take a lot of time.
There's so
And
much that comes up for me as you're saying that. One is that difference between execution and strategy.
yeah,
And I don't know about you, but for me, my strong suit was always the execution. Like, we need another office building done, but the
yeah,
strategy or the rollout. So who's the first person that goes in that building, and what does that look like on day one, and how do we staff that, and how do we make sure that we're balanced now between both buildings, and who is going to repurpose the
right.
furniture? Is that you at night in the middle of session?
Right.
So what about that did you learn about yourself as a practice owner? Were you struggling more in that area of strategy of like, wait, I didn't even put a system in place. I've got a second building. And I don't know how we're going to get
Absolutely.
there. Okay.
Yeah, because I'm like you. I'm queen of momentum. You give me a task, it is done early. And so I'd be like, and I found joy in the creativity of like, we're opening a new location. It's a new project for me. Let's run with it. So, but again, I did not have the strategy at the time. I didn't even think like, okay, where are we getting our leads from? Just like today, just networking in the community. There wasn't a full strategy involved at that time. So that is something that I have spent now a lot of my time and energy on, is learning those things, since that's something I
hmm
didn't know at the time.
hmm I remember, so my practice was a testing practice, so a little bit different than the traditional therapy model. But for years, my focus was always on getting more psychologists. And our model is a newer model where we use psychometrists to administer the testing. And that really was, sort of how we scaled, was being able to leverage psychometrists to expand in locations and put our psychologists essentially where they couldn't be. They couldn't be in 4 different places at the same time. Well, now they could, because CMS started to allow the use of psychometrists. And it was only year 7, I want to say, that I realized the high value appointment was not the psychologist appointment, it was the psychometrist appointment.
Yeah.
That was the high value appointment. So I needed to be focusing on getting more psychometrists this whole time, not psychologists. They were my most expensive hire. And they were doing, the intakes and the feedbacks, but the test administration itself, that's where that 4 to 5 hour appointment came in. And that's really what I think scaled our business finally, was having a more strategic systems based look on, well, what are your high value appointments? Just do more of that.
Yeah. And I think the fourth area for me that I wish I learned more about initially was just about leadership. Expansion demands more leadership, not more therapy hours. At the time I had a small caseload, and I was doing that, managing, the multiple locations, and it completely broke me. I had no more time in my day. I was so overworked. And one day I realized my business can't function without me at all. If I took a sick day or I came in late, or if I would come back in, I just would come into a bigger pile of work. No one was coming in and taking anything off my plate. So if nobody could step in as me and pick up any slack, I was like, what am I doing? What's the purpose of this? So for me, that was a big wake up call, because I realized the expansion isn't just a business move. It's an identity shift. Now I'm no longer a therapist. I have to step more into a CEO role. Whether I'm ready for that or not, I have to just kind of embrace it and make changes. So if someone had told me all of that up front, I probably would have ran away. No. I would have slowed down, and I would have just built a better foundation first and scaled more intentionally, because that's what I want other practice owners to know. Growth can be beautiful, but only if you're ready to hold it. Because if you're not ready to hold it, your business ends up holding you. And that's not why we became therapists. So scaling should give you some of your life back, and it shouldn't take from it. But scaling isn't the only path. Erica, I know you've run a group practice for over a decade. So why did you decide to stay, I guess, where you're at currently?
Well, I've had a couple of changes in the practice over time. One, I started off with contractors that were fully licensed, and it was an easier way to build, and it required less oversight from me with independently licensed folks. It was only just a few years ago now that I made a pivot to having W-2 employees, which is a larger financial investment. And, it also broadened my horizons in the sense that I could hire graduate level or, LGSWs, LMSWs, folks working on obtaining their licensing hours for independent licensure. So I think within the umbrella of my practice, there's been a few different iterations, and those changes have come slowly, but I think have made a positive impact on the way we operate. So in some ways, it's a younger, newer practice for the model that I'm operating with now. In other ways, we've been around for a while, and I've been doing this for a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What year did you switch to W-2?
We opened as a group practice in 2014, and I think I hired my first W-2 in 2021. So, it's been for almost 5 years of having employees now.
Yeah.
And I do think it works better as a business model for us. But it's definitely, I've had to do a lot of learning on my feet to grow this model as opposed to the old one.
Yeah. I started as 1099 as well, and we changed in 2022, but it completely kind of changes your whole business.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. I think, while owning this practice, I had a second child. I went through a divorce. We survived COVID.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of changes in my personal life and adjustments. And, in therapy practice ownership circles, I hear lots of different types of stories, like folks whose partners, co-own the business with them and help to manage it. And, I think looking at capacity, it's kind of like working with clients. Each group owner is going to have a particular capacity, like for what they have time for, what they have emotional bandwidth for to handle. And, my practice perhaps has grown a bit on the slower side, but it's because I've also been very devoted to my role as a mom, and, worked through some of my own personal challenges alongside owning the practice. So I thought of this quote I really like that I often say to clients, and I think it's applicable to therapists and practice owners, which is, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. It's
Oh,
So
Anne
true.
Lamott.
Yeah.
Well, I really like Anne Lamott, the writer, and that's what
hmm
that quote is from her. And
yeah.
that's really been kind of a mantra for me in terms of owning this practice. Like, I'm moving at my own pace and speed, and keeping in mind my own capacity for what I can handle. And that's mostly kept me in line.
Yeah, I think that's so true is you do have to put the blinders on when you're building your practice because you can't possibly compare yourself to someone else's outsides. It's, you have no idea what their struggle is, what cross they're battling that day. And,
So true.
it's like when I think about your style versus Jen's style or my style, to me, it seems very different, but I think a great way to show that you don't have to be a one size fits all cookie cutter leader for it to scale, for it to grow, and for it to be successful. To me, when I ask about your culture, and you've had people that have stayed with you for a long time, really good retention, you've got this very relaxed approach of like, oh, yeah, we'll do like bowling or we go and we do that, like you have all these great things that you do with your people. And it felt to me like that was really natural for you, Erica. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I could see Jen like me and being like, okay, we have 8.5 people. We need one more person in here for it to be successful. And for you, Erica, I could see you like meeting someone at a coffee shop and being like, do you want to work for me? And then them coming to work for you for like 15 years.
Oh, well, I mean, I do need accountability too in my work. So I have found that in having a coach and, some peers that I can talk to about my practice. Because, yeah, with the approach you're describing that I may or may not have, everything could go off the rails pretty fast.
Mhm. Yeah. But I also think that's what makes people want to work for you, right? It's like you have to be a leader, not just a manager. And there's a big difference between managing people and leading people. And not everyone has that unique ability to get people motivated enough to want to continue to work for them. And I know we all say it's with them, but I think at the end of the day, you're working for someone. You know that there's a certain percentage of what you're taking in that that group is taking. And uh, I think that there's sort of a unique personality that can leverage culture enough in this day and age that people are like, I know I could make more elsewhere, but I really, where else would I go? Like, this is where my heart is.
Erica, did you have other roles that you were in where you were maybe leading naturally, in retrospect, like looking back?
Maybe. I guess, I was a teacher. That was my very first position out of college. So leading classrooms of 7 and 8-year-olds for a few years.
Yeah.
Um, I did have the camp counselor role, early on, and kind of youth leader type role early on in my life. And that's maybe what led me to social work. I have invested in learning how to be a leader. I also have a best friend that has an MPA and is a manager by trade. So I get a lot of helpful hints from her.
That's
um,
nice.
yeah, but in terms of leadership, it's been steady growth and a lot of inner work as well in order to balance the empath and people person aspect of who I am with having accountability and rules and guidelines. Another quote I like, or something similar from Brene Brown, is that having boundaries is kind, and
Hmm.
Yeah.
so I try to extend kindness to my team by having boundaries and expectations for them. That's something that's ever evolving, but I think I may have picked that up from Brene's leadership book. um,
Hmm.
that I read some years ago. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of a conglomeration of factors, I think, that's made me who I am as a leader.
Yeah, and you hit on that piece that at least I struggled with when becoming a group practice owner, which was, why would anyone want to work for me? It felt strange. I had like a whole self-esteem issue I think I was dealing with. So it was hard for me to put boundaries or expectations out there. I think I was so shocked that anybody would want to come work for me. So that was the hardest thing, I think, for me, is a little bit of imposter syndrome of like, who is gonna, I've always felt like a 7-year-old in a 45-year-old's body, it's like, who's gonna listen to me?
Yeah.
All right, kids, we're all getting together. I just didn't ever feel like a leader.
Yeah.
And I really struggled with that imposter syndrome with my people. I mean, group meetings, I've said before, group or all hands were like the biggest nervous point for me, was all these eyes looking at me like, where are we going? What are we doing? Are we looking good this quarter? That sort of thing. I was just like, why am I this person that's in here?
Yeah, there's definitely some imposter syndrome that comes along with the leadership role. I
Mhm.
agree with that. I think particularly that can come up for women in leadership roles too. And, you know, something I've had to work through as well. So I relate to that.
Yeah. When I was in Vistage, and I highly recommend that for anybody that's a group practice owner that just feels sort of alone in scaling their practice. Vistage was really helpful because it's sort of like this group of other CEOs, and they've got different programs and stuff. But I joined I think it was called like a key man group. And everybody had different businesses, right? So this person could own, let's say, a fire hydrant business, but they had the same pain points that you had. Everybody has the same people problems, the same growth problems, systems problems, numbers problems. And so that was really helpful for me to see other people in these leadership roles that also struggled with imposter syndrome, that were just in there trying to figure it out every day. It also became like resoundingly clear to me that there is a big difference between a CEO and an entrepreneur. And I started to feel much closer to that entrepreneur. That's where I identified, versus the well-heeled CEO, is the person that could be, sort of like, I think of it like a person that would be a president. You're diplomatic, you're not going to say anything wrong. You're not going to offend anyone. And yet you're a culture builder, and you can see the big picture and the vision and the strategy, and you enjoy that leadership piece, but you are also great at not just the execution, but the strategy. Do you feel like you've kind of got that finally, like you hit your stride in that role, either you, Erica, or Jen?
I think it's still a work in progress for me. I think I'm in a better place, but I think that's an area that I'm always trying to excel and I'm always trying to learn.
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
talking about the CEO role or the entrepreneur role, or
Well,
both?
for me, the CEO role was something that I just realized, oh, that's why something feels off, because I don't feel that my strengths are aligned with being someone that's very measured, well-heeled, sort of thinks about things. What's the saying? You measure twice, cut once. That's how I picture a CEO to be, is someone that's like, well, we'll see next quarter. That's going to work. And meanwhile, I was like up in the middle of the night, like, guys, I've changed our entire EHR, and frustrating everyone around me.
But I do think a CEO in our industry is very different than maybe, somebody in a different type of industry. And I think now that I've coached many different practice owners, I think everyone has their own little, who a CEO is to them is a little bit different. They take a little bit of their personality, how they like to run things. So I think there's a little wiggle room there.
Mhm.
I don't think I've
Yeah.
ever really identified with the CEO title. Not used it. I think I call myself the owner of the practice at this point and do a lot of director type, you know, have director type roles. I mean, technically, I suppose I am the CEO of this practice, but something about that title feels a bit intimidating, and maybe that's imposter syndrome at work. I do have a lot of ideas for business. Like, I could see myself really enjoying just being part of a think tank, or, you know, somebody who generates ideas for businesses but doesn't necessarily execute them all. I think that aligns with having a big vision. Like, I have this big vision, and it's taken work to kind of keep myself aligned with what I actually have capacity for, resources for, tools, because I can think really big. And I can also, in therapy, we talk about falling in love with potential. People fall in love with potential a lot. And I think I could be enamored of the potential of my business, but not necessarily, that doesn't help with dealing with the reality of it. So it's kind of a constant readjustment that I have to do to keep myself from trying to go beyond what the current structure framework is.
Yeah, I think about when you were making the decision to have more kids. Like, I remember I had my twins, and my twins are boy girl, and I thought, okay, well, I guess like this is it. Like, that's really all you need. You got one boy, one girl, you're good, you're all set. And I remember talking to my husband about, do we want a third? And for me, bigger was always better. More meant more, but for him, less was more. And he had a really good point or shift in perspective, which was like, if we have a third, we then are taking away that time and love from our other two, because now we've got to manage our attention and divide our attention between third child. And so that to me was like, oh yeah, that sometimes more is less. It's not, more is not always more. And of course we had our third 7 months later, so none of that mattered. But man plans and God laughs.
I've always heard once you have three, they outnumber you, and that's a point to consider. I just have two,
Yes.
but since I'm solo with them, they outnumber me. So I'm kind of glad I stopped there.
It's I think the basketball analogy is the zone defense. It's zone defense. You're just like kind of
Yeah.
managing, but you no longer have the man on man.
Right.
Well, I really like hearing these stories and just, how you guys approach this. And I really am hopeful for our listeners too, because I don't think it's a one size fits all. And I think someone could easily listen to me, or they could listen to Jen, or they could just listen to Erica in isolation and go, oh gosh, I'm not like that. Like, I know I certainly would probably compare myself to you, Erica, and be like, man, that's the kind of person that keeps people around. She thinks about it. She thinks about something before she just does something. I'm driving all my people nuts. And so I'm glad that we have such diversity of experiences and approaches, because I don't think it's one size fits all when you're scaling and growing. Just like in any business, every leadership style is different. And I ultimately made the decision to sell. And I think that's your third one. You think of it, know when to hold them, know when to fold them. And I was at a point where I had major senioritis. I was ready to go. And if you read any of the books out there, Built to Sell, Scaling Success, Rockefeller Habits, all of those, it says you're building your practice to sell. Like, that's really the mindset that you should be in all the time. So it was only until I started to talk to other potential buyers that I started to think about my practice the way that other buyers might think about a practice. So someone that's coming in that has more business training and less clinician training is going to look at your margins. They're going to look at your top line revenue. They're going to look at your profit. They want to know, how much are you looking at your profit? Do you know what profit is versus revenue?
Yeah.
Are you looking at your P&L? How do you find your P&L? Is it on QuickBooks, or is it on a bunch of paper spreadsheets you've got somewhere crunched up under your Rolodex. How is your system run? Right. Um, and it's interesting when you go and for a while there, I was looking at buying other smaller practices and looking at how people were sort of running their houses behind the scenes. It's all very different. And so I did start to think about my business like a business only when I was starting to think to sell. And the questions that they were asking of me, I had never asked before, but it made my business better. So, for instance, they would say, how much are you in the chair? And I was like, what does that mean? How much am I in the chair? And I realized they wanted to know, how integral am I to the revenue of that practice? If they bought tomorrow and I walked away, what would that practice look like without me? And for some people, I think they've gotten to the point where, like you were saying, Jen, you have managed the details of your practice so well, but if you took a sick day, everyone would feel your absence. They would
Yeah.
know that you weren't there, right? And while I think that calms some of our anxieties as we're doing that, it then makes it more difficult to sell if you're looking to sell your practice later on, when a buyer's coming around and vetting whether or not they would be able to take this from you. If you're in the day to day and the doctors are like, oh, I only refer because of, Dr. Long. I don't even know. I didn't know she had other people working for her. That's a problem. And so that was the next step I started working on. So I think even if you're not thinking about selling, you always need to think about, if you sold it tomorrow, is it ready? Do you know your books? Is your profit growing, or are your expenses growing? Are your people staying, or do you have a huge turnover problem? What does the industry look like? What's the TAM? These were terms that were
Mhm.
just being thrown around that I'm like, what? So that's where I was. And honestly, I would say I was toying with the idea for a while. And then I got to the place where the practice started to feel more like a prison. And then I was ready to go. And that's not where you want to be when you're selling, because it can put you in sort of a worse position, right? You're desperate. Hungry people make poor shoppers. That's sort of the saying. And so, um, I was tempering the mental headspace that had been really stressed and underwater with, and you might have to keep on doing this for another couple years and be okay with that. Um, and so for me, the decision to sell was really starting to look at the market conditions and seeing VC or venture capital backed tech platforms coming in, sort of posing like a therapy office or practice, and starting to feel like the yellow cab in the age of Uber,
Mhm. Yeah,
you
that's a
know?
good analogy. Yeah.
Oh, that
It was like, someone would call the practice and then you're like, yeah, I can get someone out to you in about an hour. Sheila, who do we have? Like, what? That's how our therapy practices were run. And meanwhile, you've got Talkspace, BetterHelp, whomever is out there doing this, where if someone wants a therapist, they click and they get that Uber right away. Someone pops up on their screen in 20 minutes and they figured out how to do it. And they have the tech backing to be able to hire for that. And these tech companies weren't reliant on insurance raises, which we hadn't gotten in 15 years, to hire their people. They had VC money, right? So
yep.
I started to see the clinicians leaving because, they could afford to pay them 90 an hour and I could only afford to pay mine 70. So what was I going to do? How is this going to go? And when I felt like the yellow cab of this thing, I was like, this is not who I want to be. Like, I don't want to be here, the yellow cab, as Uber's coming in. And so I guess I started to see the writing on the wall. And I don't necessarily think that that is the writing on the wall for our field. I don't know that it's the end of the story for our field. I don't know that it's like an Uber that just comes in and then all of a sudden you don't have yellow cab anymore. I think we're also starting to see some cracks in that idea of access. Yes, we figured out the access problem. People can access therapy within 5 minutes of thinking that they need a therapist. But who's your Uber driver? who's
Right.
gonna who's gonna work like that in that space, right? Who's there? And it's not as straightforward as an Uber drive. That person now is in charge of your mental health care. So I do think that there's going to be some cracks in this, and as time goes on, we'll see how this all shakes out. It was just for me, I started to feel like, man, I don't want to be the guy at the end of the table with like a landline connected to a wall and everybody else has a cell phone. Like I just didn't want to do that. And so I also found myself really craving creativity. Like I was doing like paint by number and watercolor and piano. I was so thirsty for some creative pursuit. And my practice really became about numbers and the P&L and just having to do all that all the time. And it was not me. That was not where my strengths were aligned. And so I realized I don't know that I have the bandwidth to build culture in a way that's going to compensate for what's out there, what people could go to, the glossy paychecks, that sort of thing. And I just was like, I need to pivot. So sometimes that question is always like, did you feel like you were failing when you were selling? And it was like, I didn't feel like I was failing no more than maybe if you're selling your house. You think about it, selling your house, usually you're either upsizing, right? It's an upward move and you're like, yay, we're going to this like nicer house, or you're downsizing maybe because you're like, I don't need that much space anymore and I'm excited to live closer to the beach. So I didn't feel that sense of failure. And I guess as like a 7 on the Enneagram, I thrive on change. I'm excited for this new chapter. If someone said you're gonna have to like do this thing for another 5 years, I would have been like, just kill me now. Honestly, just kill me now. I was like looking up like makeup artist. Could I be a makeup artist? Could I drive an Uber? Could I DoorDash? Like I just anything sounded good other than being a therapist and a clinician. And so that's when I was like, all right, it's time to pivot. And so I'm sure we'll do an episode one of these days of really like all the nuts and bolts of the sale and all of that. But when I was thinking about listeners today and like what might people want to know about selling, one of the biggest questions I get asked is, how did you find your seller? So that was just Biz by Sell. I went on Biz by Sell, and it felt a little cheesy to me to put my practice on Biz by Sell. Um, but I had worked with several different brokers and or advisors, and nobody was able to generate the type of deal heat or interest all at the same time the way that Biz by Sell is. And I don't know if that's the same for other industries, but I was getting 60 to 70 inquiries a month, of people that were interested. And of course, a lot of them are looky-loos that are just kind of wanting to see what's going on and don't
Yeah.
necessarily have the funds to buy. So I had to come up with a whole system to actually vet potential buyers and things like that. And I could talk about that at a different time. But that was where it started. And I think if anybody's interested in just dipping their toe and seeing what the market's like, what the demand is like, I would recommend just opening up an account, and you can do it anonymously. That's what I did. I didn't want to like scare my clinicians, and just kind of seeing like what are they looking for? What is the market like in, DC or New Jersey or Cincinnati? What does it look like around me? And and so what do I need to think about if I'm not ready to go right now, but maybe I'm ready in 3 years? That's the time to start thinking about it.
Colleen, something you said really resonated with me about that I had a similar experience with, that I got to the point where when I met with people to look into selling, that actually transformed my business, because then I was able to think of my business completely differently, really delve into the P&L, really think to myself, oh, I need to be more like a CEO. I can't just be a therapist here trying to run this. So I enjoyed hearing that from you, because that in retrospect was probably a really big a point of change for me as a business
Hmm.
owner, when I considered selling, to then know what I need to do to get out of the chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's where it's really helpful is, even if you're not thinking about selling right now, just understanding how people look at your business in
Right.
any regard. If you're selling your house, what do they look like? Okay. Well, that's probably only going to make your house better when you're making those improvements. So that certainly was the big key for me. And I will say, being now post exit after the sale, the psychological piece that has been nice is sitting in these meetings where some vendor is trying to pull some nonsense, as they do, and me going, oh, yeah, that's not my thing anymore. Like, I don't have, it's not my battle. I don't
So
have to talk to this person about that anymore.
do you feel more free?
Mhm.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not in a deal where I could have just walked away. I think that's most of the deals these days now, which is the most buyers of any sort of healthcare practice want you to have some skin in the game post close, right? So my deal is set up like an earnout where we have to still meet some numbers for it to be the full deal, for that to be realized in year one and year two. And I get that. I understand that. I think it would be strange to hand this off to someone and just walk away and not to have any transition. So there's still skin in the game for me post close in this practice, and that obviously I want to see it do well. And I'm still doing some clinical hours, nowhere near what I was doing before, but there is a definite moment where it sets in finally. And I mean, the day that we closed and signed the documents, I remember my friend was sitting next to me and she was like, do you feel different? I was like, No, like it doesn't feel like, I don't feel any different. I don't really know what to feel." And in the weeks post close, it has been like, oh yeah, that's not my decision anymore. And that has been super freeing.
Yeah. Because I think that's the hardest part, is having that emotional. I always feel like it's the emotional tie to parts of my practice that's the hardest for me to deal with. So you having that disconnect now, I would just imagine it's amazing and it's freeing. So
Oh, yeah, the decision fatigue is real.
yeah.
The
Yes.
Yeah.
amount of
Decision
decisions you
fatigue.
have to make a day. Yes. Every day, the amount of decisions you're having to make. Do you want them to do this? Do you want them to do that? Do you want her to do this? And it's like, oh my God. And you have to make the decision. It's not, that
Right.
it all rests on your shoulders. And some of it is scary. It's like, oh gosh, I got to do this review, and if I don't do this peer review, this all these services aren't going to get authorized again. And what does that mean for working with this insurance company? And so now it's like I can show up and do that, but I'm not feeling like the practice is on the line by every move that I make.
Hmm.
So whether you scale, stay, or sell, the real question is, are you making the decision from alignment or letting the system make it for you?
I have worked for a couple of those, companies that you named earlier, Colleen, and I think you're absolutely on target with comparing it to, Uber or, um, DoorDash even,
Hmm.
because I really do think those companies are trying to, package up therapy services into a particular, corporate little nice package with a bow on it, and optimize and, have, ratings and, target numbers. And what it does is this is a profession that, folks pour a lot of, as we know, time, effort, money, degrees, additional professional trainings beyond a master's degree, like postgraduate. I've done at least 3 years of postgraduate psychodynamic therapy training. You really can't put a price tag on the investment that therapists put into the work they do, because we are the tools of our trade. So, it doesn't really work to package it in the way that many of these companies are trying to package us. And what it does is it takes that creativity away from the therapist, the professional who is there to work with a person, another human sitting across from them. And I think that I'm not sure, if it will work or last in the long term, like you said, but there's something about all of that that doesn't quite add up for me. And it didn't work for me because I didn't work all these years getting all this training in order to be treated like, you know, many years ago when I was a teenager working in a grocery store or at a restaurant,
Hmm.
doing a menial minimum wage job.
Yeah,
So
like a widget. You were being treated
yeah,
like a widget. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and
Yeah.
a client's rating is going to make or break you, which I'm not even sure if that's ethical in our
Right.
profession, you know?
Right. Well, and I liken it to if you showed up at a hospital and these tech companies have now just packaged up surgeons. They're like, all right, here's your surgeon. And then you're just with the surgeon and they're like, we're gonna open you up and see what's going on in there. Hopefully I know how to fix it. And like that's what this model is. Like, okay, great. You guys have figured out access, but we've got no treatment plan. We've not matched anyone with the right person. So like let's just open them up and like see and like hopefully it's the fit. And, an example I can give of that in our field, especially where we do assessment, is um, we test people before we treat. So, just like if you're going in for surgery, the doc's not just going to open you up and be like, well, let's see what we find. They're going to do an x ray first and go, oh, you swallowed a stethoscope and we need to get it's over there. I need to go in there and get it. Like, they're not going to just open you up and just like dig around. And that's really what I think these companies think you do as therapists is like, it doesn't really matter what your specialty is or like your training. It just, I mean, everybody's the same. You're just talking to a human and like eventually it'll just be a bot. No, it doesn't work like that. Access, yes, they solved for that. But the care and the treatment planning, the assessment, that's what that's what dictates outcomes. So if I've got a patient and they have now been on one of these sites talking with someone that let's say is psychodynamically trained. I don't know that anyone's psychodynamically trained is going to work for what these companies pay them, but let's say that. And they're conceptualizing their hypomania as like some sort of transference issue. This person's going to keep on cycling as
Mhm.
they're dealing with the psychodynamic therapist that is completely conceptualizing it in a way that is not helpful for the patient. Versus if you're going in and you get assessment first off, and we accurately go, well, this is an ADHD, this is bipolar 2. This person has clear mood cycles, they've got hypomania, they're non functional when they're going into these bouts and then they come out of it. And then they've got depression that's lasting for 2 weeks. You don't want to treat them with an ADHD med. That's just going to make things worse. We actually got to get them on a mood stabilizer. Okay, well, how's that patient going to look differently when Dunkin' Donuts sends them to us, their employee, and now we've actually got a treatment plan, and we know in 4 to 6 sessions we can get them to see a psychiatrist that's going to get them on the mood stabilizer, and they're going to return to work. Versus they got access in 5 minutes from their lunch break, and they're meanwhile doing psychodynamic conceptualization of hypomanic bipolar.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's it's not going to be the end of our profession. And I think that's where we're realizing, okay, they did solve for one problem, which was access. But our people are people and they're unique, and each person's treatment plan isn't going to just be, humanistic therapy is good, and I think it's helpful, and a lot of people need that connection and the healing that comes through that. But there's also people that need a certain type of treatment that we know is best practice for whatever that diagnosis is. And so um, I think that that is going to be something that helps sort of save the profession, as well as understanding that this is a nuanced profession. It can't be commoditized in the way that Uber was.
Right.
Agree.